Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Leca Queen podcast, and I have a special guest here for you today. I'm so honored that Alison has been able to join me. This is Alison J. She does have an Instagram account, and she goes by the handle Long-Winded Leca Lady. Alison is very special. She's very special to me. She's very special to a lot of people in the semi-hydro world. She's very active on leca growing and semi-hydro groups on Facebook and on Instagram, and gives out the most valuable information. Thank you, Alison, for taking the time. Thank you.
Well, happy to be here.
We've put out a call on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and we've had a few questions from all of you guys, and we're going to try and go through all of your questions. If we can't get through all of them this episode, there might be another episode, so watch out for that. So, Alison, I'm just going to go straight into that now. So let's talk about semi-hydro growing in general. What is semi-hydroponics?
I have not found a good definition that I like, quite frankly. I think Ray Barkalow, the father of semi-hydro growing, right? He coined the phrase, I guess you will. I don't like his definition, I'm not going to lie. I think it has to do with just inorganic growing with inorganic media or something like that. Nothing about like the relationship to the water, but the name itself, semi-hydro, relationship to water, right?
Exactly.
And we've got full hydro, where the root zone is in the water itself. Semi-hydro, to me, it's semi. It's not, the root zone is actually in the media, and then the media wicks the water and the nutrients up to the root zone. Of course, the roots do grow into the reservoir, but that's not the root zone. That's not the core of the roots, I guess you could say. I just like to think of it as you've got a constant reservoir, but the root zone is not in the reservoir.
Right.
And we use inorganic media because we have to, because if you have a constant reservoir, if you have a organic media, it's going to degrade over time and whatnot.
That's right.
But some people they just throw around leca growing, right? I don't like to say that. I like to say semi-hydro growing because I use more than just leca.
That's right. And leca is just one of the inorganic media that you can use.
And they work in similar ways. Obviously, there are some differences, but it's all semi-hydro. So I like to say it in those terms instead of just leca growing.
Now, what would you say are the pros and the cons of growing in semi-hydro?
I think that depends on. Well, are you talking about semi-hydro versus leca, or are we talking about semi-hydro versus semi-hydro?
Let's just stick to semi-hydro for now.
Okay. I think it depends on who you are. So for me, the pros are I am a terrible waterer with soil growing. I am an overwater 100%. I can do it. It just takes a lot of energy. I don't want to be going around checking my plants every day. I can't do that. I don't have that time. I'm sorry. I've got a cat who keeps
No, that's all right. That's fine.
Okay, no. So for me, I like things that are scheduled, and you're not supposed to, with soil growing, go on a schedule. It doesn't work very well. I've tried it. It doesn't work. But with semi-hydro growing, I can do that. I put it on my schedule, right? I check all my plants systematically because I don't want to forget any. If I do them, here or there, I'm going to forget some inevitably. So do it systematically. I pick the day that works for me. I do it once, check them once a week. I don't have to worry about them the rest of the week.
That's right.
I can't do that with soil growing. Every plant has a different schedule, and, there might be some midweek checks and watering and whatnot. So for me, that's a big pro. That drew me to it and is the reason I went all in.
That was exactly my reason.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are other aspects of it. I mean, the cons are it can be expensive, especially if you have a lot of plants. I mean, the more plants you have, the more expensive it's going to be. And certainly, I think when I started, I only had probably 12 soil plants, not very many.
Yeah.
But I had reached a limit. Like, I wanted more, but I couldn't handle more. And so as soon as I got into semi-hydro growing, it's like it snowballed. Like, I want more. I can handle more.
Exactly.
So maybe, I don't know if that's a pro or a con, because you're you have the ability to get more plants, but the more you get, also the more workload there is. So it can be work.
No, I agree 100%. I mean, that's the reason I got into semi-hydro as well. And I think a lot of people find it difficult to understand how semi-hydro can actually be easier than having plants in soil, but it really just is. Once you've got that schedule and you know you're taking care of your plants on a Saturday, you've cleaned out the reservoirs, you've put fresh nutrient solution, you know that plant is good until next week Saturday.
I don't have to think about it.
Or even 2 weeks Saturday. You know, it's very possible to have a plant go for much longer in semi-hydro without you doing anything, and a plant that's living in soil.
And I check them weekly, but that doesn't mean I have to actually top them up. You know,
Or
all plants need to be topped up. Exactly, but I might just glance and check just to be sure, because I don't want them to run dry, that kind of thing. But it's like it normalizes watering. So you've got plants that have dramatically different watering needs, but you get to normalize it across, onto my schedule.
Exactly.
And I don't have to think about that. Now, I mean, there's all kinds of other factors that are not normalized. I mean, you have to figure out light, you have to figure out fertilizer. Not all plants are the same. So it's not going to be that every plant grows exactly the same in semi-hydro, but at least it normalizes my weakness, which is watering. That's the guesswork.
That's right. And that's the number one problem with plant care, especially with beginner plant parents. It's just how to get that watering just right for your plants in soil. And of course, well, you did touch on the cons. Of course, one of the cons being that
too many plants.
Well, yes. I mean, you kind of do tend to snowball and end up with a lot more plants than you planned on. But it's also the issue of cost. People get scared of semi-hydro because of the cost as well. They're like, well, the Leca's expensive. And if you're wanting to go down the pond route, that's even more expensive.
Yeah, it can be.
You know, the pots.
And getting special pots.
Exactly. But I always say you don't need special pots. You can use anything. I've got I use the same nursery pots that I'd use for my plants in soil is what I use.
Oh, yeah. I save all of mine.
Yeah. And I just have, I use yogurt pots or anything for my cash pots. So depending on the kind of setup that you're looking for, you can do it on the cheap. And then I've got some plants which I think, these I want to look really lovely, and I'll put it up in a pedestal somewhere. I want to look nice in my house. For that, maybe I'll buy a pot or something and, make it look pretty. But in terms of just plants, you can use anything. So it doesn't have to be that expensive. And bearing in mind, you're not having to buy potting mix ever again.
True. And I like the fact that you can reuse it, but I always end up needing to buy more because I keep buying more plants. So
I don't know how many 50-liter bags of Leca I've bought in my semi-hydro career. And I'm always needing a 50-liter bag just to sit there, because when it's not there, I need more Leca.
Yep. No, absolutely.
And
but you think it's going to be your last bag that you're going to buy, but you keep buying more because you keep buying more plants.
I'll tell you something. I have been known to go around my plants and just think, I think I don't like you anymore. I need that Leca. You gotta go.
No, I am a committed person, so I have a very hard time tossing a plant. I will, and I have, but I feel committed at a certain point, right? Like, even if I don't really pay attention to it, it's there. I'll take care of it.
I know, but I need the Leca.
I know. I understand.
But that's that. What can I say?
I feel like there's probably more cons, but I can't think of any. I mean,
look, there's definitely a lot of cons. You have to be committed.
Oh, and you have to be experimentally minded. I feel like because it's not. I mean, it's not a science, and it varies from one person to another. So I can tell you, I do it this way.
Yeah.
But that might not work for you. You're doing something different. You're dealing with a different plant, a different environment. There's so many factors at play. There's some things we can control, but certainly
that is actually a very, very good point that you've brought across. You do need to be very open-minded. You need to be open to self-experimentation.
And making mistakes.
Exactly. And making mistakes and going in there. I mean, I constantly say on my channel, when people ask me, can you grow any plant in Leca? I'm like, well, I don't know. But if things go wrong with my plant, I don't point the finger at the plant. I point the finger at me. Then I know I haven't provided what that plant needs. I haven't done enough to actually.
No, there's so many factors at play, and too many people, like, they fail, a plant dies, they get root rot or something like that, and okay, it's Leca's fault, right?
Yeah.
Or instead of like stepping back, okay, maybe something else went wrong, maybe something you did needs to be adjusted. So that willingness to experiment, make mistakes, try again, learn from your mistakes, I don't know that everybody has that personality, and it's not an insult, but rather just something I've observed. There's some people who just, and maybe they're better off with soil, perhaps.
That's right. It's fine. It's not everything is for everyone, and that's okay. I definitely do have that personality. I can tell you that 100%. I just
I like to experiment.
Yeah, like what happened? I don't know what's going on. I've got quite a number of experiments going on at the moment.
Right. Yeah.
Now, again, we did touch on it a little bit, but let's dive deeper into it. Cost is really a big one, especially when you're starting up. What's your take on that? Because you've got the medium itself, but then you've also got you've got the nutrient solution, you've got the pH up, you've got the CalMag, you've got the this, you've got the that.
I mean, when I got started, I was very minimal and didn't know what I was getting into. And by that point, by the point where I started learning more about pH and what type of water you use and all of that stuff, I was already all in. So I was like, all right. But it just started adding up very quickly. I think there are cheap ways to do it, certainly, but there is going to be a cost. I think that's unavoidable. And I don't know if it's more than soil growing. I really don't know. If I had 300 plants soil growing, would it be as expensive as 300 plants semi-hydro growing? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. And I actually would want to say probably not as expensive, because I love how you put it. It's when you're starting off, it's really quite basic. You can get away with just water from the tap and your nutrient solution, and that's it. And your plant will still thrive. Your plant will still be happy.
Yeah, absolutely.
But as you start to get deeper into it, then you start thinking, well, what will happen if I add the silica? What happens if I add the CalMag? What happens if I add the mycorrhiza and this and this and this? And you really start to get into it, and you experiment, and you see differences in your plants, and then you want to do more, which is okay. It's called the evolution of a hobby.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the point when you decide whether you're all in or not, I think.
Yeah. It's just making that decision. And if you are all in, it's, the cost is neither here nor there, because you're doing what you love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
So would you say growing in semi-hydro is better than growing in soil? Whatever the word better means.
No, because there's always the caveat of who's doing it, right? Yeah. You put me with soil, and boy, I'm going to have a lot of dead plants pretty quick.
Yeah.
But so semi-hydro is better for me. That doesn't mean it's better for everybody. I am always amazed at the people who have a jungle of soil plants, because I don't know how they manage that.
Yep.
I might have a jungle of semi-hydro plants, but it's not that bad. I don't really, to me, it's manageable, but I don't know how I would ever. So it just depends on the person. I don't think it's necessarily better. One is better than the other. I know people do the experiments where they sort of put one side by side, and they're sort of growing the same plant and trying to see which one is going to grow better. I mean, look, my goal is not to have the fastest growing plant ever. I'm totally okay with a slower growing plant, because I know my conditions aren't ideal. Wintertime and the light and whatever. Humidity isn't the greatest sometimes. That's fine. Yeah. Plants are a long game for me. I as long as they're growing, they're, I enjoy them. It's fine.
Yeah.
But like some people want like the fastest growth, the biggest leaves or whatever. And you can get that with semi-hydro, and you can get that with soil. So I don't necessarily think one is better than the other. It just depends on the user.
Depends on exactly. Well, I literally have nothing to add to that. It really, really does. Now, going back to the OG question, can any plant be grown semi-hydroponically?
I believe so, yeah. Can any plant be grown in Leca? I don't know about that. I haven't tried, and I moved away from Leca with certain plants long ago, just because they did give me issues. It's not that they didn't survive, like they did. I had some plants that didn't die, but also didn't really grow in Leca.
But
I think it also depends on, like, calatheas and A coffee plant was one of my early ones. It just kind of sat there, had great roots, didn't do anything in the foliage.
So what are you growing your calatheas in at the moment?
A pon or pumice, one or the other, yeah. And I have a new coffee plant because I think I tossed my early one and got a new one.
Yeah,
but that's in pumice right now and doing well. I mean, I think it's about. Well, I don't know if you want to get into the media differences. I mean, obviously that's.
Oh, we will. Don't you worry. Just hold on to that thought.
Yeah. So, I mean, can any plant be grown? Yes, absolutely. I do not see why not. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to take the same approach with every single plant, or that you're going to use the same media, or I guess if you're potting in a submerged setup, you're not going to have necessarily the same reservoir or fill it at the same time. You know what I mean? And keep it at the level versus letting it run dry before you fill it, kind of thing. So there's might be different approaches because plants are still different. They have different watering needs, so you might need to treat them a little bit differently. But I do think they can all work. I think there is a way where there's a will, there's a way. Trust
me. That is my
I
take.
fought with a few plants on that.
I know what you mean, because that's my motto. I want to try everything in Leca. And then, some plants I have conceded, and I'm like, right, okay, fine, I'll put you in pon.
Well, for me, the issue with Leca is not that Leca can't work. It's that I'm unwilling to pot in a submerged setup. It doesn't work with my needs. I can't pay attention to all of my plants or certain plants, every day of the week or a few times a week. I'm going to check them once a week. So if they can't handle the fact that, they're running dry, and seem like they run dry faster in submerged setups. It's a little more dangerous for me. Let's put it that way. I've used them, and those are the ones I tend to end up with dry rot or something like that because I neglected it. It couldn't go a whole week, so it couldn't survive with my needs. Well,
so technically, that's the plant's fault. You've touched a little bit on this next one where we're looking at, would you avoid putting certain plants in Leca, which you've already said you things like calatheas.
I do, yeah. Water lovers. I won't do it. Mm-mm.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I've got this one.
I know. I mean, it works for you, but you also I think do mostly submerged setups, right?
It is, and it's living in a 20 centimeter pot, but the number of times I go check on it and that reservoir is dry.
Oh, yeah.
Because
how often do you have to top it up?
Definitely once a week for sure. And then it depends on the season as well. It depends on, because I live in Melbourne and the weather here is just all over the place. One day it's like hot, the next day. So even saying checking my plants every week, it might be that was a particularly hot week and all that nutrient solution's gone. And I'm like, oh. Yeah. And I'll just water it and step away quietly and just...
Fingers crossed. I mean, I'm not going to say that my reservoirs never run dry. They do sometimes, and I have some plants that are okay with that, and whatever, we just get along that way. But I know if I've just had submerged setups run dry and have it go wrong. I just... It's not for me. With the wick setups, you can pick pots with much bigger reservoirs. So I might have the same size inner pot, but the reservoir is deeper or wider or something. You can sort of finagle that to work for the plant. There was a period where I was strategically repotting my plants so that I could get on this sort of normal maintenance schedule, right? So I've got some super thirsty plants. I don't want to have to water them in the middle of the week, so they're getting a bigger pot.
Right. That's a very
or
good
it might
strategy.
not even be a bigger pot. It might just be a pot with a bigger reservoir kind of thing.
Yeah. That's good. We'll talk a bit more about that when we come to setups. Do plants like epiphytes, like orchids, do they work very well in semi-hydro?
Oh, yeah, of course. Ray Barcalau that I mentioned earlier, he has been putting orchids in Leca for 40, 45 plus years. He's been doing it basically the longest. He's considered the father of semi-hydro. And he only really uses Leca. He sometimes throws in rock wool, but otherwise it's mostly just Leca. But yeah, any orchid can work basically. But he says the same thing I would say, which is it depends on your conditions because there are other factors that make or break a plant's health, and it might not work in your environment. So you have to take all the other factors into consideration.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, actually, I think when I started getting into semi-hydro and looking into leca, orchids are the first thing that popped up. Like, these are plants that do really, really well in semi-hydro. So if you've got orchids and you haven't tried semi-hydro, that might be a way to go.
Sorry, the cat just knocked a chair down. I thought it was going to happen. He's climbing on the back of it and it just went down. Yes, his name is Mischief, so
I mean, if that's what you call him, I mean, he has to live up to his name. Now, I've got a 6-year-old hanging about in the background. Why are you here? We're almost finished. Go away. You're distracting me. When I finish, then we'll go. Yes. Let's talk about media types. So we've talked about semi-hydro not necessarily being just about leca. Leca is just one of the substrates that you can use. What else can people use to grow their plants in?
I mean, the most common is pon, which I don't know where that name came from. It doesn't really indicate much of what's in it, but really it's made out of lava rock, pumice, and zeolite. Am I saying it right? Zeolite?
Zeolite, yeah.
I'm not sure. Yeah. They're all wicking. Lava rock, pumice can be used by themselves as well. They do not have to be in the mix together, but for whatever reason, Lechuza Pon put them together. It does look pretty. I like them all together because they look pretty.
Yeah.
But ultimately, Pon versus Leca, to me, from what my experience is, the difference is not the individual ingredients, but rather the size of the pieces. So with Pon, you're getting much smaller pieces. And if you use Lechuza Pon, it's pretty small. The DIY Pon that I use tends to be a little bit bigger pieces.
Oh, that's nice. So maybe I should try some DIY Pon, because I've used the Lechuza Pon sometimes, and it's great. But one of the things I absolutely despise about it is the fact that it is so small. So when I put it in my nursery pot, I have so much pon that just falls out, and I keep thinking to myself, I must put a coffee filter or something under there, and I never do, and it all just falls out, and I'm like, this is annoying.
Well, I mean, I get mine falling out too, but I think the smallest, or the most problematic inner pots that I use would be like net pots, right? The holes are big enough that stuff does fall out, but what I do is I'm potting up the plant, and then I'm dumping the cash pot back into the my pond bucket, and then and at some point it does stop falling. So really, it not that big a deal. Not that big a deal.
No, it's definitely not a deal breaker. It's just a little like, this is a little bit annoying compared to when you're using leca and it all just stays there and it's all just fine. I love the fact that it does stop eventually, especially once the plant has grown and the roots have grown into it, and it all just sort of binds together and becomes one mass, which is fantastic.
Yeah, well, but you need a good strainer, and you need a good drain catch, because you don't want that stuff going down.
Oh, for sure. You're not doing that in the sink. No way. That's just going on a dish or on a plate or a tray or something.
No, I do it in the sink, but I have a good drain catch and a good strainer.
Ah, well, no, I wouldn't. I think if my husband saw me doing that, he.
I had my pipes checked, like my sewer pipes checked, and they're like, "Oh no, it looks good." I'm like, "Really?" I figured there'd be something in there, but no. I almost broke my garbage disposal though, because of the mosquito bit thingies. I thought they would soften, and they don't soften, and those went down the drain and almost broke it. Yeah. But otherwise, I haven't had any issues.
Plumbing issues with the substrates.
No. Knock on wood.
That's good. So now we'll go back to, what are the differences between, a substrate like pon and a substrate like leca, especially when you're talking about the size and why that matters?
It comes down to how much moisture they hold. So you get more surface area just because you have all these more pieces that can have more surface area to hold more moisture versus leca,
when you're talking about that, you're talking about things like pon. So pon has got more pieces and is going to hold more moisture.
Yes, smaller pieces. Yes. And then there's also the oxygen factor, right? With leca, you've got bigger pieces, more air space between the pieces. With pon, you have less air between the pieces, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but for certain plants, they may need more air to the roots.
So for plants, for example, plants like an alocasia, for example, you would probably want to be using leca more than pon.
I actually have all of mine in pon. There are some plants I feel like could work well with both, and I feel like alocasias maybe. I've never tried them in leca though, so I couldn't say for certain on that one. But like syngoniums, I have some in leca and some in pon. They both do fine. Philodendrons, I feel like it kind of depends on the type, but I for the most part, I feel like they could go either way too.
So I also, because I've struggled with allocations sometimes.
I saw that video, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm like, I don't know, what do you want? So I've got some allocations in pon doing beautifully, and then I've got some allocations in leca doing beautifully, and I'm like, well,
it can work out both ways. I mean, and I also think it depends on your pot setup, but I'm guessing your pot setup is probably the same either way, right?
My pot setup is the same either way, but what I have done is actually I've reduced the size of the reservoir as well, so it's not getting as much. And I do let my allocations dry out actually a little bit.
Oh.
Yeah. I found that works for me. So who knows? I don't know. But I do have a calathea, which is living in leca at the moment. It's not doing well at all. And every time I look at it, I'm thinking, I probably need to move you to pon at this stage, because this is not working.
Yeah, I feel like when those guys stress out too, they take a long time to recover.
Exactly.
So I one of my first ones that I put in leca was a peacock. I don't remember the specific
Makoyana.
name. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
It didn't do badly. Well, it did. It stressed out, but I kept checking it. The roots were fine. The roots were great. What's going on? And it just sat there and did a whole lot of nothing for the longest time. And finally, I don't remember if I moved it. I probably didn't move it to pon because I don't think I was using pon back then, but I may have thrown in like rock wool or something that gave it more moisture in the root zone, and threw it in my cabinet, and it finally recovered. But it took a good couple of years to fully recover.
Wow.
I mean, it's doing well now, but it looked pretty bad for a while there.
Now, it's all going back to what we were talking about earlier. It's just having the spirit to keep going and to keep trying different things, because there's no one solution for any plant. You just have to keep trying.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I had the worst experience with, I'm not sure I'm going to say this right, Aglaonemas, Chinese evergreens.
Yes.
They hated me. I don't know how many I killed, but I love them. And I was like, I'm going to figure this out. And it's so weird because I did a pseudo experiment. It wasn't a very good one, but I did like one with submerged, one was shower watered, so I just watered it weekly, basically no reservoir. Yeah. And then the other one was with self-watering wick setup, right? The shower watering one did the best and the fastest. The self-watering wick one, forget it. Like it didn't, I don't understand it. Like, then that was probably my problem before, is I was always putting them into wick setups. It didn't like it. It didn't grow roots, basically. And the submerged setup did grow roots. It just was a little bit slower than the shower watering.
Than the shower one.
Now, I don't continue to shower water them after they transition, right? So that's sort of like in a transition approach. I do that for a couple months, and then they've grown new roots and they're adapted. I can add a reservoir with
the wick. Yeah.
With the wick setup, yeah. So that took a lot of learning and experimentation, but I figured it out. Now I don't kill them anymore.
Oh, that's great. Oh my gosh. Yeah, it's all about, just I'm going to try again, and I'm going to try something else until you submit to my
basically.
Oh my goodness. So, basically. And I guess the question of what media is best is,
Yeah.
it's redundant, really. There is no such thing as what media is best, is there?
No, it drives me nuts when people are like, I've got all my plants in Leca, but everybody says Pon is better. I'm going to move them all over from Leca. But how are your plants doing? Oh, they're doing fine. I just, I hear Pon is better. No, don't do that. If they're doing well, leave them alone. Why would you do that? It's not an either or question. Like, I use both. It depends on the plant that's in front of me. And if a plant isn't doing well in one, then maybe that's a good reason to switch it over and try out another. Right. I don't know. But if it's doing well, if it's not broke, don't fix it. I don't understand why. Yeah. But I see that all the time. But yeah, I don't think one is better than the other. I don't have a preference. Honestly, if it was my choice, I would use Leca all the time, only because it's easier, it's cleaner, it's cheaper.
Yeah.
But I do tend to use Pon more these days just because I have a lot of water lovers.
Yeah. Now it's a really, what you've said is really quite true. And I would be the same. If I had a choice, I would use Leca all the time because, I did call myself the Leca queen.
Well, it's in my name too, but I'm sure people wonder. But and
I keep telling people, look, Leca's my OG. Okay, Leca is for me. That's my bestie. But I will try other things depending on the plant and depending on what that plant needs. Right. So, it's not everything has to be in Leca. It's semi-hydro, but it's what works best for that particular plant. That's going to be the best medium for it.
Exactly.
Just to clarify, in case people didn't get it, the size of the media. So Leca is like this, and Pon is teeny tiny. That's going to determine how much air there is.
Yes, some people like to think about it as air. I like to think about it as moisture, but I think it's both factors together. I had a friend who was like, "Yeah, we think that." Leca doesn't work as well because there's too much air around the roots. I'm like, well, I guess, but it's also less moisture for the roots. So, it's both, right?
Yeah. That's right. And depending on the plant, your plant might need that. So a plant that needs more of that, depending on the plant. So the smaller, the bigger, you just have to try and see what works best for your plant.
You have to experiment a little bit, but for me, like if I'm not sure, if I get a plant I've never dealt with before, I'm going to search up, what's the watering care, suggestions on the internet. So I'm just searching that plant and it's soil, but it's still helpful information. Like if this plant likes to be consistently moist, but not too damp. Too damp in soil means there's compacted no oxygen, which we don't have that problem in semi-hydro. So I don't think about that. But as far as like consistently moist, then I'm thinking, okay, water lover, probably going to do better in Pon. If it's a plant that needs to dry out in between waterings, then Leca is the obvious choice.
Leca might be the best way to go.
That doesn't mean it's not going to work. Like, you might be able to put those plants in Pon and they'll do great. Any plant can adapt, or some plants can adapt to either condition. So you might have good luck. But then again, you might not. And, that's where you need to experiment and figure out what went wrong, I guess.
Think about what might work. Let's talk about pot setups. I know this is your favorite subject.
This is my
setups.
Bread
what kind
and
of setups people can have in semi-hydro, and what works for you?
Yeah, I'm a wick setup all the way. I was doing the wick setups long before anybody else really knew much about them, other than Miss Orchid Girl.
Okay, so what is a wick setup?
I don't know. A lot of people struggle to wrap their heads around it, but the difference is your media in the water, nutrient solution, or is that reservoir separate from the media, with the wick being that sort of intermediary that carries it to the media and the roots, right? And that's a very different relationship. What happens is if you have a wick setup, it is going to be slightly drier than if you have a submerged setup, although it does depend on how much of a reservoir you have with a submerged setup. Obviously, you can vary the size of your reservoir and get more or less moisture. But with wick setups, it's going to be a little bit drier. I like that because it gives me a little bit more control to then adapt that pot to fit whatever the plant's needs are. I could add an extra wick. I don't tend to do that much anymore, but you could add extra wicks to make it a little bit more moist. The placement of the wick, like whether you leave it at the bottom of the pot or you pull it up higher, can make a difference. I don't know that it makes that huge of a difference, and so I don't really pay much attention to that anymore. I tend to do it the same all the time with all plants.
So you just leaving your wick right at the bottom?
No, I pull it up over a layer of media.
Okay.
So I'll just put like and then put it, and then maybe a little bit more media on top if I have the room. But those are things you can vary to sort of vary the wetness, the dampness in the pot.
Mm-hmm. How is that different from the Kratky method?
I mean, a Kratky originally was meant for lack of a better word, throwaway plants, like veggies or herbs. You're going to harvest them and you're going to be done with it.
And that's
so the whole point of it was you were starting with your reservoir submerged up pretty high. You've got seedlings, and then you have just enough nutrient fertilizer in there to last that plant until it's ready to be harvested. So the water level is going to drop over time. But and it might drop below the level of that inner pot, right? What do you call it? Then like the net pot or whatever. The water level will drop below, but by the time it drops below, you've got roots that have grown down into there, and they're basically the wick, right?
Yeah.
But I know people do the sort of, what is it called, deep water culture now. I think that's pretty much Kratky, although there's a lot of variations out there.
Yeah.
How is it different? I mean, I'm not starting submerged. I don't keep my water level up. When I put a plant in a wick setup, my wick goes in there from the start. The reservoir is below the inner pot, so it's going to be relying only on that wick from the start. I just have better results going that way. I think if you submerge especially with Pon, if you submerge it, it can be too wet for some plants, and you could end up with like stem rot or something like that. Whereas I feel like it's a little bit more controlled with the wick, like just the amount of moisture.
True. So with that, when you're using the wicking system, it's then really important to get especially if you're using Leca, to get it pre-soaked. Is that right?
I mean,
Does that make any difference?
Are you talking about like making sure it's wet when you start, or are you talking about like actually
making sure it's wet and saturated with, so you didn't just rinse it under the tap. Does that make any difference?
Not really. My ready to go bucket of Leca or Pon for that matter are both without lids, so they can air dry in the basement so I don't get mold. So a lot of times when I'm grabbing from the buckets, it's dry, which is fine. It doesn't matter. But I'm not going to leave it dry, because dry Leca is a very, very harsh root environment. So I'm not going to leave it dry. I don't understand the approach of dry transfers, dry transitions. That I don't understand that. Like, I'm never going to do that to my plant. If I'm potting up the plant, when I'm done, I'm immediately pouring nutrient solution right over the top.
Right.
So I don't leave it dry.
And that works just fine. So you then don't need to soak it for an hour or two before you use it.
Well, yes, I do, but that's for a very different reason.
Okay.
I'm not soaking it for that one use. I'm soaking it for, I don't know. I'm soaking it for a different reason. Like, I might soak it for a week, especially Leca. Pon, I don't know that Pon needs the soaking. I do it anyway just because I'm not sure. But Leca, the reason we soak it is to pull out stuff that is in there when they make it. Yeah. So I do that, yes. But it might, once I'm done soaking it for a week or longer, if I forget about it,
then that's it.
I'll strain it, and then it'll sit in my ready to go bucket, which probably will dry out. But it doesn't really matter at that point. It's not about it's just about getting that stuff out of there. Yeah, and then it's out of there. It can dry, but I am gonna wet it right away after I put the plant in it, so it's not gonna. I do like working with dry media just because it's easier to like scoop into the pot. Otherwise it sticks.
It does, yeah. Especially Pon. It's very messy to work with. I find it very, very messy. It's just, it gets everywhere. And you can't pick it up. I mean, Leca is so much easier because you can just pick up the Leca ball and that's it. Mm-hmm. It's done. But Pon
do you have one of those scoops? Do you have one of those little scoop things?
I don't have one of, I have a scoop, but it's not one of those little, usually they're like purple or whatever, the cute little plastic ones. I don't have one of those. Probably because
You should get one. They're handy.
I don't use that much Pon. I think that's my problem. I don't use that much.
It is more expensive than Leca. I'm not gonna.
Yeah, everything
is
expensive here, but it's way more expensive than Leca for sure. For sure. In fact, the only Pon that I've got is the Pon that comes with the pots. So when I've bought a lechuza pot, it comes with Pon, and I'm like, yes, I can finally experiment with Pon.
Yeah, well, they do say here that lechuza Pon is cheaper. I haven't done the cost comparison personally, but I think lechuza might actually be cheaper than DIY, what I do. But I haven't figured out a good way to cost compare it with quantities that I use for whatever the ratios I'm using. I don't know if that's even going to be accurate.
It's always very difficult, and you invariably almost always never comparing like for like when you're doing things like that. So it just comes down to, hey, this is what I do. I don't care. And you move on.
Exactly. I like it. I like what I'm using. I don't see any reason to change. So
exactly. What can you do? So when you're using the wicking method, you're obviously then using 2 pots and not 1.
Yes, necessarily. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Which I know kind of ups the cost and factor for some people and can sort of, I know a lot of people do like the clear glass jars.
Please tell me your take on the clear vase Instagram.
It's not for me. It's not for me. I mean, I get it. These are, personal preference questions. I don't have a personal preference to seed the algae. I'm sorry. I just don't like the buildup. I don't want to have to clean it. I like what I always call forever pots. I don't want to have to repot my plants. Unless it is a plant that I know is going to progressively get quite big, then I'll start, and it is already small, right? But I still do leaps and bounds with my sizing up, right? So I don't have to repot very often.
Yeah.
But I feel like when you pot that way with the glass, eventually you are going to have to get that plant out of there, or you're going to have to do something to clean the algae out of there. That's not for me. That's too much maintenance for me. I mean, I don't consider myself lazy when it comes to semi-hydro growing, but on that factor, I'm too. No.
It's almost like, why do I need to do this when I can completely avoid it?
Yeah. And also, I will say, I feel like people get a little obsessed with perfect roots. I think not all roots are going to look bright white and perfect. As they age, they start to darken sometimes. And sometimes you're going to have some dead ones in there too. And it's okay. It's okay. As long as the plant itself is healthy. I mean, look at the foliage. If it's healthy, you don't
just
see
leave
signs
it
of
alone.
stress. There is no reason, to get rid of those roots. But if you're looking at a clear pot, it's not going to look as pretty anymore.
It's not.
So I think we get a little bit obsessed with the perfect roots. And I kind of sometimes prefer not to be able to see my roots for that reason. Like, I don't need to obsess over them. The plant grows fine, it's fine.
What is the difference between wicking pots and self-watering pots?
They work the same, but there is a difference, right? I mean, this is technically speaking a self-watering pot, right? So you've got these plastic pieces. Well, not that one, I guess. These plastic pieces, the middle piece, the media actually sits down into that and can be sits in the reservoir. Yeah. Now, I added wicks anyway. I always add wicks to these pots anyway, just to make sure, because I don't know how much media is actually getting down in these little things.
Holes. Yeah.
So I do it. I don't know how necessary it is, but with just a plain wick, you would have a flat top. So then you would have, or a flat bottom, I guess, and then there would be a reservoir with nothing in that reservoir but the wick, right? So they do the same thing ultimately.
Yeah, I do the exact same thing. I've got self-watering pots, but I put the wick in there as well. Just because I'm just like, I don't trust that Leca's getting enough. So I need that. And I put the wick in. So I've got some lechuza pots. And you know what I do with my lechuza pots? I go and I actually make ventilation holes in them. And Yeah, and then I just completely decimate the whole thing. I would not be taking it back for warranty. They would not take it.
I get it. Yeah, no, I'm always creating holes for wicks if I have to, right? Just melting some plastic, which is toxic, by the way. Make sure you do it outside.
It's so funny that you'd say that. I've literally just done a video where I talk about the tools that I use for growing my plants, and one of the most
Hmm.
essential tools is my soldering iron because I need it
Soldering.
to make
Yep.
holes in so many things. So many holes. Talking about soldering iron, how important
Yeah.
are air holes in the pots? Do you need air holes? Ventilation holes? Are they necessary? Am I wasting my time by making holes?
Well, I mean, when I first started, it was all orchids, and I always did the holes on the sides because air ventilation, I mean, they need a lot of air to the roots. I don't think it makes a difference because
Mm.
I do have some orchids that don't have him that, I got later and I just didn't make the holes. I stopped doing that. I'm not going to lie. I definitely don't do it with any of my other plants, and I might
Yeah.
still have some of those pots laying around that I might reuse now, but I don't add holes. I don't think it makes a difference. Let me bottom line. I really don't. I mean, you
Okay.
would need to play around with it, but I don't think it'll make or break.
That is very
Well, I mean,
interesting.
Like this one has no holes. Look at that.
Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't. Yeah.
I mean, it's fine.
Is that in
I
Leca
got like
or
8 other ones. It's in Pon, but there is Leca mixed in. I always mix Leca in my Pon just because.
Yeah, I see.
It
I
makes
see
it go
that. I
farther.
see that. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that is very interesting. I might have to do an experiment on that one.
Yeah,
It would
I don't
save
think it
me.
makes
It would
a
save
difference.
me a lot of time.
And honestly, I've come to hate the pots that have like slits and stuff on the side because I'm sure you've seen it where the roots just like grow out.
Yeah.
And then like philodendrons, my Birkin decides it wants to grow all of its roots upwards, and then I can't like I lift it and all the roots come out and then I can't get the roots back in right. It's such a I don't think it makes a difference. It's more of a pain in my butt than anything.
Yeah, it's weird how I know what you're talking about with the slits. That definitely happens. I've seen that. Because I make my own holes, I don't have pots with slits. They just have little holes. And I don't
Yeah.
have too many problems with the roots going into the holes, except with plants like my Chinese money plants, for example. I actually have the actual plant growing out. The pups grow out of those little holes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm like,
I've had an alocasia corm do the same.
yeah, I'm like, what do I do now?
Well,
So, yeah, maybe there's a lot to be said for not making those holes.
I mean, I buy a lot of pots that have the slits already. Like the ones I really like already have the slits. I mean, I'm not gonna not like them just because they have the slits. But if it was my choice, I'd prefer not to have anything.
Not to have
and
them,
I know a lot of people don't like with this. People don't like to not be able to see their roots, right? I mean, it drives people nuts. I'm fine with it.
Yeah.
Totally okay with it.
You're
Less of
weird. Why don't you want to look at your roots?
I mean, it's fun to look at roots, but I'm more. I don't know. I mean, it's not the end all be all of the health of the plant, honestly.
Yeah, but it's got nothing to do with the health. It's got nothing to do with the health of the plant. It's just look at those roots. They're so pretty.
True.
So what material, what do you find is the best thing to use to make your wicks out of?
I do not use the wicks that come with pots that have wicks. Usually those are either cotton or cotton blend, and that will degrade with time, and I like forever pots, so I don't want to have to repot and take out a wick or anything like that.
Yeah.
Do I know for certain that it'll cause a problem? No, because I've never tested it out for several years to know.
Yep.
I really like using microfiber. So I buy mop heads and I just take them apart. Basically, use a seam ripper, take them apart, cut them, and then I make my own, tie the ends, and they work really well. It's not the only thing. It's not the only possibility. Some people use chunky synthetic yarn, or cut up microfiber towels into strips. I've heard of people doing that. I'm sure there's a lot of options out there, but I just really like my mop heads.
So the only reason you definitely wouldn't use a cotton or a cotton blend substance. And is that just purely for the degradation reason, or is the kind of material that the wick is made out of, does that influence whether it's going to have more, bacteria or algae or whatever growing on it?
I've heard of people having mold problems, certainly. I don't know from personal experience though, so I've just always used microfiber.
I wonder if, people who have mold or algae problems on that, what kind of setup they've got.
Well, I mean, actually, I should say my wicks do get algae on them if the pot itself is not completely shaded from light, right? I'm still going to get algae on it, but whatever. It's the same as, algae just collecting on the inside of the outer pot.
reservoir.
Big deal. Yeah. I don't see it, right?
Yeah.
But mold, that's a different issue. I have had mold on a wick once, but that was not because of degradation. That was because I reused a wick without sanitizing it, and then it had ended up with some mold. It didn't cause any problems for the plant or anything.
Yeah.
But if I am reusing a wick, I've learned from that experience to sanitize them before reusing them. Yeah. So that's where I'll use Physan 20, and I'll just soak them for I don't know how long. I stick them in a little container of Physan, and they might stay there for a week
and
before I remember them again.
And you go away and do other things.
Yeah, right.
Come back when you remember.
Come back, rinse them off, let them dry, and call it good. And I haven't had any issues since.
I get this question a lot. Right. People say to me that the leca at the top of my pot is dry. How do I know it's dry? How do I fix this? Is this harming my plant? What's your take on that?
I mean, as a chronic overwaterer myself, that dry layer at the top can make you freak out and think, oh no, my pot's dry, it's drying out too fast. But the pot is a gradation of wetness, right? You get the wettest at the bottom, you kind of a medium, and then the top is dry. Now, the top might not always be dry, but most of the time it is, at least in my environment it is. Except for plants that are in the cabinet, but that's different, higher humidity. But that's normal. It's okay. You have to suppress that urge, because if you don't, your overwatering tendencies will take over, and you're going to overwater. And you can overwater semi-hydro plants. I don't care what anybody else says. You can overwater them.
Yes, you can. Yes, you can. Okay. If someone really doesn't like the look of that dry layer, can they keep it moist with some sphagnum moss, perhaps?
I mean, I wouldn't personally. I don't do that. I feel like if your top layer is dry, which is normal, it also is probably going to dry out the spag very quickly in your whatever your environmental conditions are in terms of humidity. You're probably going to have the same problem, and you're giving yourself more work because now you have to come around and spritz it every day or whatever. If you want to do that, I don't know. I think it's unnecessary. I don't think it really accomplishes much. Now, I will say there are some plants, most plants, I guess I should say this too. The roots are underneath that layer, right? Most plants have the majority of their roots well below the top. So they are not feeling that dry top layer.
That dry top, yep.
That being said, there are some plants like orchids, or some I'm going to say that wrong.
Anthuriums.
See, I read all day. I don't say these things. No.
Yes, one.
There are some of them that do have roots that grow up top, right? And the problem with orchids, I know orchids in particular, and in my environment they do this. So they will grow aerial roots, and those roots will reach into the pot, and then they will desiccate. They'll dry out and die. They'll stop growing. Because dry leca is very, it pulls moisture from those roots, and then those roots desiccate.
Yep.
So what I do, and I really only do this with orchids because it's really my only problem plant, is I put aquarium rocks across the top of the pot. Actually, I do with pumice too, but for a very different reason, because pumice looks gross after a while on the top, so I put the aquarium rocks on there to make it look pretty. Yeah. But for orchids, I put them on, a layer of aquarium rocks, and then the roots are reaching in there. It's holding a little bit more humidity in, holding a little bit more moisture in, and those roots can work their way. When they reach down, they work their way through it, and they're not reaching quite as dry of leca, and it's not necessarily going to desiccate them. So I think that's a better approach. That's more of a long-term, I don't need to pay attention to my plant kind of approach, personally.
Yeah. The good thing with that as well is those rocks are inorganic, whereas you've got your sphagnum moss at the top, and that's depending on what kind of setup you've got the moss falling into your reservoir or falling into, it just gets messy.
I don't know if it would cause a problem, honestly. Again, don't have personal experience with it to know whether it would cause issues. I know a lot of people are hypersensitive about, you leave any soil or you leave any sphagnum moss on your roots, it's going to rot them immediately. That's not my experience.
No, it's definitely not. I mean, I've actually put sphagnum moss at the top. I've tried it because someone was talking about it. So I put some moss at the top of my leca, and all I found was it was just getting into my reservoir because of the way I've got my pots, and I didn't like the look of that, and I just pulled them off, and that was it. And then I had moss in my leca, and I had to repot that whole pot because I didn't want that moss in that leca. So
well, and you use moss poles, or at least you were using moss poles.
I do use moss poles, yeah.
Doesn't the same thing kind of happen where
no, because when I'm making my moss poles, I actually have a flap where I actually close off the bottom of the moss pole. So you've got a separation between the moss and the leca. So you never have that moss going into the leca, and it's sitting right at the top. Okay. So yeah. So that's not really an issue. But yeah, this is another one. This is an age-old question. What happens when the roots are growing inside the reservoir? For those of us that aren't using the wicking method, but even if you are using the wicking method, you still have your roots growing into the reservoir, don't you?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So
absolutely.
what happens? Are you repotting your plant every single time? Are you cutting the roots? What are you doing?
I'm just leaving them. I don't I mean, okay, so I mean, here's the thing, and you have more experience with submerged pot setups than I do, but just through observation, and a lot of people post about monsteras in particular, the roots start to rot, or Hoyas even. I think there was who was it? Somebody posted a video, why I hate leca, and the reason she hated leca was because the roots grew into the reservoir and rotted, and she had to keep repotting.
I need to find this video.
All you needed to do was put them in wick setups, and you'd have been fine. You didn't need to keep repotting them. So that's the thing. Like with submerged, some plants, when those roots go into the reservoir, they need, for whatever reason, I've only been speculating on this. I can't say, it's just from observation. I have Hoyas with roots that are in the reservoir and have been in there for close to 3 years now.
Yeah.
Not a single bit of rot.
Exactly.
And so when I see people who are posting, my Hoyas, this always happens with my Hoyas, or monsteras, it's like, that doesn't happen to me. Why, right? The only thing I can figure is the oxygen to the roots. So when you have a separate reservoir from the inner pot, and the roots are growing down, let's say your inner pot ends here, you've got roots growing down, and your reservoir doesn't start until here, those roots are gaining oxygen with that air layer there between the reservoir and the bottom of the inner pot. And then the roots can happily live in the reservoir, but they're also, they are also living in that airspace at the same time. So that's my theory. It's obviously not scientific. It's the only thing I can figure is the difference, because I haven't had those issues that everybody else is complaining about. Now, the workaround I've heard of people doing with submerged setups with like Hoyas and monsteras that tend to do that is having a wet-dry cycle. So letting your reservoir run dry completely, maybe even letting it go for a day or two, and that's what gets me, and I can't do that because I don't pay that close of attention to my plants.
No, I definitely don't. If my reservoir is dry, it's because, oh, dang, I did not mean that to happen.
But to plan around that, like if you've got a Hoya and you need it to have a wet-dry cycle, and then, you have to watch it. Like, when did that reservoir go dry? When did I refill it?
I have over 60 Hoyas. I couldn't do that. I've got a Syngonium that's, the roots are just there. And I'm thinking, based on what you're saying, maybe that's where my little ventilation holes come in.
Maybe, but are you also maybe even accidentally letting it run dry in between?
Look, I just do what I do. I don't have, my plant care is not a science. That's the thing.
I know.
So this is kind of answering your question in a way, because it's not, I am not obsessing over it. So I'm not thinking the level has to be here. I'm not thinking, it's going to be dry tomorrow. So next, I need to come back on Wednesday. Then I'm not doing that. But clearly there's something that I'm doing that is enabling.
And that's working, right?
Yeah.
And we don't know. It only becomes an issue when somebody has their roots rot out and they're like, why? What did I do? What can I do differently? And it's like, well, something, and that may have been people who were always keeping the reservoir at a certain level. Like somebody who's new, and instead of letting it drop a little bit or
Yeah.
drop most of the way, maybe they're just keeping it at that level, like overwatering in a way,
Exactly,
right?
exactly.
Sort of, you're a helicopter parent of your plants,
I am not a helicopter parent for my plants, not at all. And I'm certainly one of those who very naughtily, sometimes I just don't get to them. Even after that week, I just don't get to them. And I'll get there and the reservoir's dry, and I'm like, oh, shoot. And for me, that's okay. That's okay. It's not what I preach. I tell people, don't let your reservoir run dry. But then I also tell them, listen, life happens, If your reservoirs run dry, don't obsess about it. Just, maybe be extra nice to your plant for the next few days.
Well, I will say there is a difference, though, between a dry reservoir in a submerged setup versus a dry reservoir in a wick setup. Because when you have roots in the reservoir in a wick setup, they don't have the media there around them that might still be retaining some moisture. They go dry and they might get
really
dry
quickly.
rot. Yeah. So it is more important, and maybe that's a con or a downside to a wick setup. But for me, I just know, if I'm checking everybody, I know how much I need in there to make it to the next week kind of thing. And I just make sure there's always a dribble in there or something,
Yeah, no, that's so right, because my thinking is always, okay, I know I probably should have filled up this reservoir 2 days ago. It's a bit dry now, but I think I definitely can get away with it because my roots are in that media. It's not, the leca's not dry. I know that the leca in there does have some moisture from the reservoir before it went completely dry.
Yeah, so, dry reservoir is not the same as dry media necessarily, especially in submerged setups. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, well, this was very, very interesting. And I think that's all the questions that I have today on semi-hydro growing and things like that. And next time we're going to touch on lots of other subjects. Pests is a favorite one that people love. Nutrient solutions, pH up, pH down. What kind of water should I use? Is tap water fine? Do I need to get a reverse osmosis unit in my home under my sink? All those questions. So hopefully we can have the pleasure of your company again, and we can hopefully look at all those questions.
All right. Sounds good.
Yeah, sounds good. But thank you so much for taking your time out to come and have a chat with me. And I know lots of people will be very excited to see you and listen to everything that you've had to say. And I don't know if you guys really love what Alison has to say, which I know you should have done because she's got lots of interesting things to say. Check out her Instagram account. She has lots of very useful posts on there. She does lots of very interesting experiments, and there's lots to learn. I mean, it's the thing I love about semi-hydro is it's a learning curve. The learning never stops.
Yeah, no, I like that. Some people don't like it, but it's definitely something I like.
The learning never stops, and there's always something. We all do things differently, and you can always pick up a few nuggets from what other people are doing and try and apply that in your setup and make things more efficient, maybe. Thank you so much. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on the Leca Queen podcast.